Okay, happy Halloween, folks, and welcome into this webinar about data in trust and safety, a panel discussion with trust and safety curriculum authors. My name is Amanda Menking. I am the Director of Programs at TSPA and our sibling organization, TSF, the Trust and Safety Foundation. We are so happy our panelists could be here with us today. They are all over the world and joining from different time zones and taking time out of their work days and their personal lives as well. So we really appreciate them being here. If you are here, you probably know what TSPA is, but just in case you don't, we are a nonprofit that supports the global community of people working in online trust and safety. So we work alongside trust and safety teams to help them develop skills, expertise, and relationships they need to navigate this really unique profession. We're also a forum for trust and safety professionals to connect and network with their peers, to exchange ideas about how the work of trust and safety is done or may be done or might be done, and to find guidance about how to think about their own career path. One of the things we really love to do is to share the expertise of trust and safety professionals for other folks who are in the field, or for newcomers to the field, or for folks who may think they want to be in trust and safety in the future. And our curriculum is a really, really great example of this. And it's all written by folks like you see here, by experts in the field. So I'm going to turn this over to Harsha. She is our curriculum working group leader. In fact, she's been with TSPA, I think, longer than most of the TSPA staff members have. So she's truly an expert. And she's going to take it away.
Thanks, Amanda. Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here. My name is Harsha. I am a trust and safety professional with over a decade of experience and expertise in scaling and maturing strategic operations, as well as developing and implementing policy solutions to reduce harmful and unwanted content online. Like Amanda said, as a member of TSPA, I'm leading TSPA's curriculum working group. This working group was established a little over 3 years ago. It was a pandemic baby. Our goal is to design and develop the trust and safety body of knowledge. That is, the concepts, terms, activities, and practices that have more or less become a standard over the last 2 decades or so of trust and safety. And experienced practitioners from the industry, like many of us in this panel, who have been in the thick of the day-to-day challenges, they volunteer with this working group to develop the curriculum. And we truly hope that whether you are a trust and safety professional or someone who's aspiring to be one, or even if you're a company that's building or maturing its trust and safety team, we hope that this curriculum helps you or provides you with relevant context and considerations to navigate this really complex and evolving landscape. And lastly, I'm also very excited to share that we already published 9 chapters, which cover multiple core topics, ranging from how content moderation works, how policy development works, what are some of the legal considerations. And one such recent chapter we published is focused on how trust and safety teams use data. So I'm really excited to be here today with the authors who spent a lot of their valuable time and shared their expertise to put together such a valuable resource for all of us. So without further ado, I will pass it to them to provide a quick introduction about themselves, and then we'll take a few questions to talk about how data is used, to talk more about this chapter, challenges, opportunities, and whatnot. So I think we can do alphabetical order. So let's do Irene, James, Melanie. If you can take a moment to quickly introduce yourself.
Sounds good. Thanks, Harsha. My name is Irene. I currently work as the Senior Director of Wellness and Resiliency here at TaskUs. I lead a global team of over 125 coaches, counselors to deliver innovative, brain-based, and proactive care to our frontline content moderators. Additionally, I also oversee the Wellness Division of Research. We are a team of behavioral scientists and data experts, and our main goal is to conduct large-scale, impactful research to improve our employee well-being, inform our programming, as well as informing best practices for the trust and safety industry. A little background about me. I am professionally trained as a clinical psychologist and data scientist. And I'm particularly good at leveraging both quantitative and qualitative insights to inform policies and business decisions. In my previous life, I was a well-recognized academic researcher in the field of suicide and self-injury prevention and treatment. I have published over 20 academic papers on this topic with over 4,000 citations. For today, I'm very excited to join this panel to nerd out with James and Melanie to talk about data in trust and safety. Just a quick note that views today are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of my employer.
Hi, everyone. I'm James Gresham. I have been in data science and analytics for over a decade now, most of that being spent in trust and safety in content moderation spaces. I've worked in places like search, video content, and I also worked at Meta on their kind of general overview platforms as well. So I've gone through a fairly wide range of data roles, some of which were very focused on metrics and presentation of data, all the way through to data engineering, setting up and building pipelines and similar. So I've got a pretty good broad overview of data practices. I also spend a lot of time volunteering with TSPA, and I'm also a big advocate for improvements in systems like emergency alerts for various prediction and prevention of criminal violence.
Hi, everyone. I'm Melanie Ensign. I am the founder and CEO of a company called Discernible. We are dedicated to cybersecurity, privacy, risk, and trust-related communication projects. So we're a multidisciplinary team with a variety of different backgrounds, kind of a cross-functional partner team for our clients. And previously, I led security, privacy, and engineering communications at Uber. I worked with trust and safety teams there. I also worked with trust and safety and security teams at Facebook, and before that, AT&T. So I am on the public-facing side of a lot of the policies and a lot of the work that the trust and safety teams are doing. And so I'm very familiar with the use of data to make those decisions, as well as, and there's a portion within our chapter about how do we communicate about that use of data and how can we use data in communications. So I was particularly interested in that portion of the chapter. I'm also a certified rescue scuba diver. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of how I approach different types of trust and safety incidents. I'm a huge fan of prevention, if at all possible. But then we also have to be prepared for the fact that some things do happen, and we need to have a process and a procedure for how to handle that. And there's certainly some data-driven discussions and decision-making within that space as well. So really excited to be here and really honored to be here with Irene and James, amazing collaborators.
Thanks so much, everyone. I really like the scuba diving example. Also, folks who are joining the panel, a quick trigger warning that through the panel discussion, our panelists might sometimes use examples that may be related to self-harm or other severe content types. So just a heads up that that's coming. All right, before we jump in, actually, do you all want to take a moment to talk about why someone should read this chapter, or what made you write this chapter? Irene, you can go first.
Yeah, I can jump in. Well, I think for me personally, having been at different settings, both in academia, clinical work, and also business settings, my experience is that a lot of times we don't fully leverage the data and the information that we have to the fullest extent. And we can have a separate discussion why this is the case. A lot of times not because we don't have good intentions, because, limits of time, capacity, do we have the talent and all that infrastructure to make it happen. But coming from a data background, I know the power of insights from data. So I think sometimes we make decisions based on best educated guesses. But I think if we actually have the time, capacity to dig into the data, I think a lot of times we can make decisions with much better confidence and certainty of what will likely be the outcome if we go this route. So this is why I joined the data curriculum to write this, because I really want to take this as an opportunity to spread the information to the industry of how we can leverage data so that we can do better as an industry. In terms of who this chapter is for, I would say when we wrote it, definitely it was a Venn diagram of data and trust and safety. So there are pieces that, maybe it's data, but not specific to trust and safety. There are already plenty of resources out there, so we did not focus on that. But I think the main audience, I would say, are data professionals who may be new to trust and safety or just recently in trust and safety, as well as trust and safety professionals, but maybe did not come from a data background, but maybe consume data on a regular basis. So it's with those two audience in mind when we wrote this.
I'll add to that and say that trust and safety teams often, they work at kind of an intersection of some really critical areas, right? Safety being an obvious one, but we also run into questions and conversations about data privacy and security and things like anonymity and all of these other areas, that intersect with trust and safety in incredibly meaningful and important ways, right? And as a cross-functional partner to both the data teams and the trust and safety teams, my function is often tasked with explaining to various stakeholders, both inside the organization as well as outside, on how an organization is using data for trust and safety. And that surfaces a lot of questions, when they bump up to some of these other really important issues. And so I wanted there to be a publicly available resource that would help trust and safety teams better articulate and explain their work, particularly the importance and some of the methodology behind how they use data to accomplish some of these, whether it's policy goals or like very tangible trust and safety goals.
Yep, 100% in agreement with everything that Melanie and Irene have said. I definitely was thinking about it from the context of new data professionals and people who are kind of tangential to the data space, but not necessarily already deeply invested in it. The ability to explain the various kind of contexts of the places where data is powerful, but also the places where it's limited, the places where you can get the most value out of your potential data, and also the general idea of trying to find ways to drive good decision making. Data is like raw fuel for good decision making, but it requires careful handling and manipulation in order to get the most value out of it instead of just throwing it onto the fire. So for me, it's a big part of it is about setting people up to develop in that data space, to understand what are the best paths to go down to get the most value out of their data.
Thanks, folks. That's super helpful. Irene, James, actually, both of you touched on it a little bit, that this is helpful both for current professionals or someone who's new and trying to navigate this landscape. Would you say, or what would you say are some of the types of data, or are there any specific metrics that new professionals or people who are not necessarily data experts should keep an eye out for? Or what kind of metrics or tools would you suggest that they keep an eye out on? Or how do you go about making that decision? Because I know it's not a, one size fits all answer.
Sure, I can go with that. So most platforms will usually have some sort of prevalence metric, basically a measure of how bad things are on the platform, and some kind of actions metric, how much stuff are we doing to make it better. That tends to be the kind of metrics that are in common, and they can vary substantially depending upon what problem spaces you're dealing with or what areas you're working in. However, it's almost always a good idea to have a set of alternative metrics and counter metrics in order to try and catch problems in those spaces. Things like monitoring speed of reviewers or your speed of taking action, monitoring your quality of reviews, how many mistakes are you making while you're taking various kind of actions. So it's always good to have a certain element of questioning, just rather than rely on a single one or two core metrics to drive everything. You should try and have a wider set of context. It's always good to have metrics that you can directly influence. That's helpful, but it is easy to get tunnel vision on those. I like to only focus on the things that you can directly move rather than the things which are bigger or at the population level. And the other thing I'd say is that basics matter. It's really important to get simple counts of all the different elements, and that's often the easiest and most intuitive way to explain things to people, rather than things like normalized or statistically altered versions of things. Having those basic counts across the board is a really accessible way to explain what's going on in any given space, particularly when you combine it with things like examples.
Yeah, I can add to that from a process standpoint. Unless it's a brand new company, you're the first person on the trust and safety team, usually there are already existing data and metrics being collected. So I think before you jump and create new ones or determine which ones are important to you, I think it would be good to kind of take a landscape view of what's already being recorded. Sometimes a lot of information can come from log data itself. And also check across department, because sometimes other departments might have data sources that you're not even aware of, and there might be value in just, kind of like James said, have different sources of information to inform you what is actually the broad picture. So after you get a better sense of what's already being collected, how different teams are using it, then you can also determine which ones are important. Do you need to create new metrics based on your goal? So are you just trying to observe certain trends, or is there something you want to monitor on a more close, like daily or monthly basis? Or is this a new solution you're trying to assess the efficacy? So these all determine what kind of metrics that you're looking at. And I know Melanie loves talking about communications about data. So another thing to consider is, what are you trying to communicate? And that can also factor into your decision point, because there are certain metrics that might be very helpful for us, but just by nature, it's hard to explain to non-technical audience. So also think about the goal, the end goal of communication, and all these can help inform you in terms of what metrics you track, what metrics you create, and all that.
Yeah, and to that point, Irene's right. I'm always like harping on the communications point, because it's so much of the work that we do in trust and safety, if we're not actually building trust, then we need to like rename the profession. But as James and Irene mentioned, some of these metrics are going to be either industry or platform specific, right? Depending on what your organization is actually doing, what the technology does, how people engage with the platform. But as a communications advisor, I also think it's really important that we think about the values of the organization and the communities that we're working with or that use our platforms, right? So if you're not in touch with the community that's using your technology, you might never know which issues are most important to them. And I think sometimes, regardless of what helps us from a business perspective, in terms of just like raw financials, we also really need to be concerned with how the people on our platform feel about the safety issues. For some communities, certain types of account abuse or fraudulent behavior are particularly more worrisome than for communities on other platforms, and a lot of that is product specific. But you wouldn't know that if you don't ever ask the people who are actually using the platform, because for other communities, the more sensitive or more, I would say, urgent issues might be related to mental health or communications among users on the platform, right? How they're treating each other, right? And so the point is to really understand what matters most for your situation, both in terms of all of the performance metrics that James mentioned, and also, making sure that you're measuring what matters to the people who are using the platform, because sometimes we might measure something simply because that's what matters to the community. And if we're going to build trust, we need to be really mindful of their perception and what would make them not just feel safer, but actually have a safer experience.
I think those were some really good points. Like we touched on, like what's the objective or what's the goal that you're going after, and data availability. And I think one of you mentioned a really good point is which metric are you actually in a position to influence versus not, or is that what you're going for? One thing here, this also came as a question from Eventbrite, is how do you go about identifying or making sure that you're actually looking at the correct data, accurate data? And I know ensuring high quality data is not, it's expensive sometimes. So how do you go about making sure that it's high quality? And how do you strike that balance between always looking for something high quality? And I know we also have tight deadlines to manage. How do you strike that balance? Melanie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can go first. So I know from our team's experience, sometimes we work with data that we do not own, but maybe have access to, and we learned it the hard way. I think it's best to loop in your stakeholder from the very get-go, because it might, the data label, you might think it is what it reads as, right? But it might mean something different until either you get access to a glossary, if they do keep a list of definitions or formulas, or you actually need to meet with the stakeholder who owns the data and have better knowledge of what this means, what other factors might impact it, how often do the meaning, the formula change. So those will all help you determine, is that something that you can use reliably or use over the long term. And in terms of dealing with the time crunch, I think our team, like everyone else, definitely experienced that. It's constantly a trade-off. But do I rely on existing data that might not be exactly perfect for this use case, or do we try to collect new data that's more specific for this project? I would say we definitely evaluate based on what's priority, what's more impactful, and we prioritize those projects for any potential new data collection. There are ones that I think, depending on situation, maybe you don't have influence in terms of the timeline, but there are ones that, for instance, we are doing some pilots and we need, A/B testing pre-post data. So we actually intentionally delayed the pilot just by a few weeks so that it matches with 2 existing data collection that we are already doing. So it just fit perfectly that we are leveraging 2 existing data collection points to be the pre and post for those 2 pilots. So this helps us because we don't have to, create a whole task force to collect the data. And then from the participants' standpoint, we're not asking them to do a new survey or participate in this new study. It's just very seamless for them. So these are just one example that potentially you can see if you can influence the timeline a little bit to match what's already being collected.
Yeah, the point that Irene raised about being able to compare to some secondary source, being able to get some kind of verification is really helpful. If you can't do it with 2 different data sources, which is ideal for doing things at scale, take a few extreme examples or some weird edge cases and test those manually. Do a quick spot check on a couple of specific points to see if you can find something that appears to be broken or wrong in some way. That's also my kind of general advice on this kind of question, is that it's things which are extreme outliers, strange, weird, unusual, unpredictable in some way, they're generally what we're looking for, both when we're thinking about things actually changing in the real world and us wanting to monitor and see what's going on. But they're also the same things that we look for when we think there might be a problem with data quality or some kind of bug or error or issue. So it helps to start building into your processes and your monitoring a certain amount of tooling and ability to check for the weirdest edge cases. What is the biggest outlier in this space? What is the most extreme example in this space? And that gives you the ability to go and spot check specific points where things are at their most extreme and where they're most likely to be strange problems. And if you can find a problem, you can then extrapolate out and see, okay, is this a big problem or is this just a specific thing in a specific case?
Melanie, anything you want to add? I have a follow-up question.
Oh, go ahead with the follow-up.
No, because it's interesting because both of you mentioned like one workaround or one way to go about it is to compare it with other sources of data or other types of alternate metrics that are available. This is also slightly related to a question we got from Eventbrite. It was one of the most recurring questions is, does that mean someone working in trust and safety, whether they're a data professional or not, should they have those data skills? Or to what level of expertise should someone who's aspiring to join trust and safety aim for?
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. I was just going to say, and I'll just say this as somebody who does not come from a data background. So if you are new to the space like I am, there's hope. But I think just like different types of like literacies and different become important in professions over time, depending on the evolution of the technology and the cultural issues and things like that. I do think that everybody working in trust and safety needs to at least have a working knowledge of data. I think that's true for just about everybody outside of trust and safety as well. But I just want to note that, and you don't have to be a data scientist or an analyst, but you do need to understand the basics of how your platform or your organization uses data in a bunch of different ways, right? Because Irene had some really good points earlier in terms of different teams own different data sets. They may not know what everybody is working on, and so that level of communication and visibility is really important. But you're only going to be able to connect those dots if you have that just basic working knowledge of how data is being used across the organization. And you need to understand how to actually interpret reports that you're getting from the data scientist or analyst team. And so this is really important, not just for fact checking your own work and conclusions that your organization is making. James had a really great point early on in the conversation about it's not just about the data, but the decisions that are made from that data. So you really need to be able to kind of hold yourself accountable and not just rely on the technical data experts to do all of that interpretation for you. In fact, there's a book. I'm dating myself, but there was a book that we had to read in college called "How to Lie with Statistics." It's actually about how to do the exact opposite, right? In terms of how to identify bad use of data or incorrect, inaccurate interpretations of data. And that's a really good place to start for those of us who don't come with a formal training in data. But I do think you're doing yourself a huge disservice if you don't at least develop a working knowledge of how data works in this space and within your particular organization.
Yeah, I would say that the amount of specific knowledge you need in the data space will depend a little on roles, because obviously there's a huge variation between what you need as a data engineer who's going to be doing coding most of the time, to a data scientist who might be doing loads of statistical testing and loads of experimental testing, to a business analyst who will be spending a lot of their time communicating and visualizing data and finding ways to explain it in the clearest possible way. So there's definitely a wide variety of exactly how much you might need depending on the specific role that you're potentially interested in. And there's a lot of transition between those roles, because as people upskill and they develop their abilities in specific areas, they might move from one area to another, or based on interest as well. I absolutely agree with Melanie's point, though, about the best thing that you can do is make it easy for people who are not full-time data professionals to understand and access as much of the data as they possibly can. If you are in a situation where every time there's a data question, every time there's an urgent request looking for some specific number which isn't in a dashboard, they have to go to a data scientist or a data analyst and say, can you drop whatever you're doing and pull this for me? That's a huge time sink for everybody involved. It limits the ability of your wider team to get context about the data and to upskill themselves in terms of their general data skills. It's something that's really it can really hold back the development of a team if data is only done by data professionals. It's something that should be like a smooth transition from the most technical members of your team and the ones who do the most weird and obscure statistics and mathematics to the ones who are just like primary users of data or kind of more passive consumers of it.
Yeah, I echo what James and Melanie already mentioned. And I'll answer the question from a few different angles as well. So I think totally agree with Melanie. You don't necessarily have to have a data background, and at the same time, it's important if you rely on data as a source of information for business decisions, strategic plan, all that. I think it's important to be discernible, and we do note some of them in our curriculum. For instance, like understanding basics of correlation does not mean causation, or if someone give you some numbers that seem really out there, and be able to question them and asking them, hey, can you walk me through how you got this number? How is this calculated? Just, be a good discernible user of data. And if you happen to, let's say that you supervise some data professional, but you're not a data professional, or you rely heavily on data to make critical information, I think in that case, you do need to have a trusted person who do come from a technical background that can vet that for you. So that can help you have some level of confidence in the report or data you're getting, even if not coming from a technical background. And also, I would say, as a data person with data background, I think all of us can do a better job of actually communicating technical information to non-technical audience. We do discuss this in our curriculum about the DIKW framework, right? Data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. I think a lot of reports that I see from data professional, a lot of times they just end at information. Okay, this number. Okay, and then but then for leadership executive, what does this mean? That's good. Is this bad? Do I need to do something? There's not a lot of information there. So I think we can also meet people not from a data background halfway there to actually provide them, not just leave it at the information level, but what is the insight, what is the wisdom for the team.
Thanks, folks. Also, just to add one point to that, it also depends on the size of the organization, right? Size of the trust and safety team, or the stage of it, because at least from my understanding, early trust and safety teams, sometimes you have to wear many hats, and one of them could be being the data analyst, even though you're a policy person or a program manager. But in large teams, you probably have that advantage of having a specialist. All right, by the way, we see the live questions that are coming in. I'll probably do like one or two more questions that came from Eventbrite or that were pre-planned, and then we'll jump into the live questions. So thanks for being patient. All right, actually, wait, this is a question that we got from about the curriculum, which is, how are you thinking about anchoring the curriculum so that it's broadly applicable to the range of companies and members? We got this from Eventbrite. I can take this, but Amanda or others, feel free to jump into based on your experience of writing the chapter. 2 points here very quickly. One, we strive to ensure that there are multiple authors for every chapter that goes out. All the chapters that we published so far have at least 2 authors. And we also strive to ensure that there's diversity in authors' backgrounds in terms of the types of companies and the size of companies and professional experiences they've had. And the second thing is that we also reach out to industry experts and industry leaders, subject matter experts, to review the chapter before it goes out, so that even after authors write the chapter, there are enough subject matter experts with varied experiences that are double checking and making sure that the content is widely applicable to different companies and members. So I hope that's helpful, but anyone else? If you want to
Harsha,
add?
if I might, there's just one point that I'll add that maybe other folks aren't aware of, but when Irene, James, and I worked on this curriculum, I lost count of how many times we would remind each other that that's only possible if you have this kind of budget, right? Or that's only possible if you have this kind of scale from an organization level, right? Because all of us have worked on big global scale projects like this in terms of trust and safety. We've also worked with or for small companies, and we're very much aware of the gap between, what somebody at Meta might be able to do with their resources compared to like a smaller startup that is just getting into the space, ironically, with the luxury of knowing in advance a little bit of some of the lessons that the bigger previous players had to learn the hard way, right? And so for what it's worth, this was something that came up in our discussions a lot because we wanted this to be useful to people who don't work at those giant companies. Like, the teams that we worked for over the last 10 years don't need us to tell them how to do this. We learned how to do it alongside of them. And so we really were thinking about, for the folks that don't have that experience or who perhaps are the first trust and safety team member at their company, or who are building a team from scratch, what lessons can we bring from our experience working at those larger platforms that are actually actionable for people that don't yet have those types of resources. So I'm glad this came up in the question, because it was something that we talked a lot about as we were developing the curriculum.
Thanks, Melanie. Last question from me before we move on to live questions is, we also got this from Eventbrite, part of it. How, in your experience, how have you used data to demonstrate the impact of the work that trust and safety teams do? Or what kind of metrics in your experience are valuable in that regard?
I can start with this one. It is most of what I actually do all day, every day, is influencing perceptions with data. And so, in my line of work, data about expectations, perceptions, and trust are things that really go a long way with business leaders, right? And sometimes that data may come from outside your organization. So, I'm interested in metrics and data on things like brand trust, reputation, sentiment, right? If we have low trust scores with our key audiences like customers, regulators, policymakers, and even recruits, everything else the business wants to do becomes a lot more expensive, because we have to spend more political and reputation capital, and sometimes financial capital, in order to get those things done, if at all, right? I think we all know of examples where companies tried to do something from a business perspective and were shut down because they didn't actually have the public trust required to pull it off. And so, at least in my experience, data that comes from outside of our organization in terms of how everybody else thinks our trust and safety team is doing can be very impactful in getting the resources that we need to be successful, but also in communicating the impact and the value that those teams have on the organization.
I can speak to it from a wellness standpoint. So for my department, we provide proactive care, and it does require, investment from the client, from the business, because we are designating time to provide wellness care for our frontline moderators. So we routinely gather data and conduct pilots. So I think a few things that we do is, if an A/B testing or randomized control trial design is not possible, then gather pre-post data to use data to indicate the efficacy of the programming. And whenever possible, track not only, data you care about. So obviously we care about wellness, but the business or the clients might also care about, KPIs or employee satisfaction, those data sets. So also be able to demonstrate value, not only in the immediate metric, but also see if it's transferable to other metrics. And whenever you can, use the value of numbers. So if you can demonstrate, oh, we implemented this intervention, or we implement this feature, and we resulted in X percentage drop in fraud activity. We're able to save X number of money for the client or for our users. X number of exposures reduced. If you can demonstrate that, I think we can, get the broader leadership and business on board to further invest in a business. And just one example, we recently conducted a wellness pilot for a few campaigns, and we were able to show that, through an A/B testing, we're able to show 50% reduction in attrition. So the number is very clear and very loud in terms of what's the pattern. So anything that you can demonstrate the pattern and value of trust and safety, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think this is a challenging space because the ultimate goal of a lot of trust and safety teams is preventing harm to users, and harm is something that is inherently difficult to quantify. In areas like spam and fraud, often you can put a dollar value on it by saying, hey, we stopped X number of spam results being shown to users, we improved our overall quality of our results, we prevented fraud requests that would have amounted to this amount of dollars. On the other side of things, you get the more extreme examples of harm where somebody is in physical danger, or where there's things like networks related to things like child safety, related to human trafficking and things like that, where really it's less about the numbers than it is about are you preventing substantial amounts of harm in a really significant way. And venting those kind of things isn't something where you can create really solid metrics on, but it is something where you can tell tangibly whether you are making a significant impact in that space.
Right. Thanks, folks. I know we have a little less than 15 minutes. We can jump into questions. Thank you all for the incredible questions to start with. James, you talked about predicting negative behavior. This is a good question. How do you balance privacy concerns when thinking about predictions or anticipating risks or measuring risks, so that it doesn't turn into a surveillance kind of situation?
Sure. It's always a challenge in those kind of spaces, and there is always an element of context involved. The amount of time and effort that you put in to invest, and the amount of data that you look at to investigate someone who's made a serious threat to life is always going to be different than the amount that you're going to make for someone who made an insulting comment or someone who you think is posting spam. I think automation is something that helps here in the sense that it means that human beings don't have to actually look at through people's particular data, and it's only relevant if someone is flagged as seriously suspicious for a specific point. So that's generally a preferable way of doing things in those spaces. The other thing is to try and primarily rely as early as possible on the data that is the most public and the most accessible, that is the least likely to be generating privacy concerns. So for example, your username and profile photo are not things that most people would consider private or would be considered worrying if somebody could see them. But your private messaging history might be something that is extremely private and would only be accessed under the most extreme of circumstances and under the most extreme sets of cues, usually only if it's been explicitly reported to us by someone who is already on that message thread. So that kind of thing it's about saying this is the kind of data that is reasonably that it is reasonable to potentially access under these sets of circumstances, and setting up the rules and boundaries so that you are accessing the data in those contexts. I will say that most more general data tasks are about catching large groups of people rather than looking at any individual. So the limitation, there's some definite limitations on how much any individual person's privacy is violated when you, for example, catch a large cluster with a specific signal.
Yeah, I think there's a good example here, James, if I may.
Sure.
I think one of the least controversial, like predictive situations is on things like spam, right? Where we know based on data that most accounts that are spreading spam are young accounts because they haven't yet triggered some other rule within the platform to either suspend or block or shut down various functionality. And so in that kind of a situation, behavior is predicted not necessarily on like who you are as a person, but if it's a young count, there's just a higher chance that you sending messages and posts to thousands and thousands of people, there's just a higher percentage that's spammy, right? And so I think it's important to think about data in that type of context as well, and also keep in mind that some of the decisions that are made based on that behavior needs to be balanced, like James said, with other factors. And so for a more serious, or I would say even more consequential decision, we shouldn't be relying on just one red flag to say, this is necessarily a bad thing based on the individual, right? But as James mentioned, context really does matter. But I bring up the spam example just to illustrate the fact that there are not privacy invasive use cases of where predicting behavior does create a better experience.
Yeah, that's a great example, Melanie. And it also ties into this important point about you would need to know that someone is mailing thousands of people. You wouldn't need a complete list of every single person that they mailed and the complete content of every one of their messages to identify that. So you might need data in aggregate, but you often don't need the specific potentially privacy concerned data to work out what's happening in a given space.
All right. Thanks, folks. Also, can I make a shameless plug here that our team is working on a chapter that potentially answers a lot of these questions around privacy considerations. So hopefully you will get more information on that soon. All right, let's move on to the next question. Also a really good question. So when we are considering any sort of a metric that measures the exposure of good actors or bad actors, or that measures prevalence, how do you consider the severity of that prevalence or exposure? Do all prevalence metrics mean the same? I mean, that's how I translate it, but anybody would like to jump in?
So yeah, I can jump in on this one. So there's places where things like exposure are particularly relevant, particularly when the actual harm is coming from the content itself, in terms of the content being shocking or distressing or upsetting to users. And then there are places where exposure is almost like the opposite of what is being looked for. Groups like networks of people committing criminal activity who are using a platform and are actively trying to stay hidden and concealed. So definitely there is not a perfect one-to-one correlation for every prevalence metric. Sometimes it's about views and sometimes it's just about people being there and doing things. When you consider the kind of issue of severity, there's generally been a lot of resistance in the industry in trying to create some sort of like explicit thing saying X number of cases of spam equals 1 case of hate speech. Because it gets you into a very messy ethical space, and it's not something that is easy to put any kind of tangible value on. There's usually some kind of stack ranking where we consider, yes, obviously, extreme violence is worse than probably worse than like online bullying is probably worse than spam or minor cases of malware. But there's generally not like a mathematical formula for that, because that necessarily say that we are basically saying that X number of cases of this thing which is not serious equates to one extremely serious thing, and that can create a lot of controversy and a lot of challenges.
Yeah, for my team, we have done composite score before, not necessarily on severity, but I think we did it, I think, a very similar rationale. I think a lot of times when we communicate to stakeholders, clients, it's for them, it's much easier to understand, where we at, is this effective, for when there's only a single number. So I definitely see the attractive piece of doing that. And I think just to give some concrete tips, one is to really understand what is the goal of this communication. For instance, if we're using the severity number, single number, tell us which area we need to focus on. Then I would say have a conversation with your stakeholders about, so that everyone agree on what's the meaning of this. And for instance, what does above 80 mean? Does this mean we take action? And when you discuss the weights, also have stakeholder input as well, because the weights determine, right? You're already putting value on which one is more important. Is it frequency or is it sharing and all that? So make sure that you have alignment for the composite score you're going to create, and then also balance, scalability as well with interpretability. So are you able to easily explain what this means and make sure, it's statistically sound, that it's normed properly?
All right, thanks, folks. Let's do one last question. So this from, sorry, I'm just reading to make sure. So this is someone who's working as a trust and safety professional, and they use data fairly often, ranging from spreadsheets to SQL queries and whatnot. What other skills would someone like them need to move up in the career ladder, per se?
I have one suggestion that I don't know if many people would consider this a skill, but I would disagree with them. It's a skill. And that is industry relationships with collaborators and peers outside of your organization. The reason I say this is a skill is because establishing and maintaining relationships does not happen on its own. It does take effort, and it does take some skill in communication and networking. And it's not necessarily implied in everybody's job description. But if you're in trust and safety, it is really, really helpful and invaluable that you do things like this webinar and other things with the Trust and Safety, Professional Association, where you're getting to meet people, you're exchanging experiences and knowledge. If you are in a position where you're working with law enforcement, having some relationships in law enforcement are very helpful as well, right? Not even just because you may need to tap into those resources at some point, but also because understanding that perspective is really important. If you're on the receiving end of law enforcement requests for data, and you haven't adequately explained to law enforcement in advance what type of data you even have, you might get a warrant or a subpoena for data that you don't have, or the request is incomplete based on how you store or query data within your organization. And you lose so much time and energy in that back and forth, just getting a complete request from that law enforcement officer before you can actually respond, which in many jurisdictions is a legal obligation. So time is of the essence. So I think those relationships and identifying who are those cross-functional folks that you need to have relationships with and nurturing them is a skill that is going to be really critical, especially if you want to get to a leadership position within the profession.
Yeah, that's absolutely in agreement on that one. Comms in general is gold in terms of it's just so broadly useful across such a wide variety of roles. I often find the kind of skills taught in project management courses are often helpful as well, both from a comms perspective and from an organization and structure, and being able to express ideas and make plans for how to achieve specific goals is also helpful. From a data side specifically, there's also if you're looking to go into data science or data engineering or those my technical side of things, Python is probably the next step from SQL and dashboarding, just because it's by far the most common language aside from SQL that's used by data scientists and data professionals.
All right. Folks, thank you so much. This was a wonderful conversation. I will now pass it on to Amanda.
Sneaking back in here. For those of you who asked questions through the Q&A and they weren't answered, don't worry. We will record those questions. They won't get lost, and we will send them to our panelists to see if they want to provide some answers to them after the event. And then Kristen, our amazing events and comms manager, will be sending out an email to everyone who signed up for this webinar via Eventbrite with a link to the recording that will be posted to YouTube, as well as with specific answers to your questions. So if you didn't get them answered live, or you didn't get them answered maybe via the Eventbrite, don't worry, we'll get some answers for you. And of course, just another plug to read the chapter. Some of the questions may be answered in the chapter. I'm a former and sometimes current teacher, so I have to say, look at the syllabus, read the chapter. You might find some answers there as well. But don't worry, we will get around to those. Just want to thank everyone for being here today, and just take a moment to really applaud our panelists for volunteering to write this chapter, which required a lot of work on their part and a lot of time on their part, and collaboration, as Melanie talked about, on their part. And they did this to make this knowledge available to everyone freely. So big congratulations to them for it being published, and a big thanks to them for writing it and taking time to be here today. Check it out, tspa.org. You can find all of our curriculum there. And happy Halloween. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.